This week on Late Breaking News. After discovering how good the good solders and fluxes are, I'm not using any of this eBay solders and fluxes anymore. Kind of makes me wonder how many people won't try a project because they find it hard to solder, when in fact it's just the poor consumables they're using. To the bin with you. Brown eBay PCBs can also go in the bin, because you just touch them with an iron and the copper falls off. China can make good stuff, like our local solder is made in China and it makes nice shiny balls. The JLC PCBs are good, because even with repeated removal of parts, the pads don't fall off. Our second news item. As a tip, it might be a good idea to get some of these hollow point tools. They can push out solder that are blocking holes, or push the pins out of through-hole parts that you have cut off. Now back to our main news story. Well, the big KiCad 4-5 controversy wasn't a controversy, it was a missing file. When you make a project, you get a project name with this -cache.lib. This stores every single symbol in the project. If you look at the original download, it doesn't have this cache.lib. So when we open the schematic, you're supposed to open it from the Pro, but I'll just open it from the schematic. You remap symbols, you close it, you go to a thing and you get all these question mark boxes. Then you go to the tools, then edit symbol library references, and just map the orphans. It finds about 10, and you go apply and OK, and some symbols turn up, but none of them are connected, so you've got to manually reconnect them all. And if you go to another page, it doesn't find all the symbols, so there's still question marks. Now we go to a copy of the Frankenstein hardware, but with the cache.lib file, and we open it. All the symbols are there, in every view, and working fine in KiCad 5.0. I guess the guys at KiCad knew what they were doing with this remap thing. The problem is when I asked on the forum, no one knew, so not even they knew what was going on. Eventually one guy worked out that it was a missing file. Well, it's all sorted now, OpenZ's in 5. I might even go to 5.1 when I have time. I might even see if I can move this blue writing so I can see what's underneath it. I also figured out how to get an individual file from the GitHub. You have to be signed in, click on the file, then just right click on RAW and save link as. We return you to our regular program. Hang on, where's the linear regulator and the power supply circuit? Frankenstein is more of a complete unit, so it has most of the extras. But the problem is it has a fixed connector. This makes it easier to manufacture as a complete unit, but if you don't have this connector, you're up for a $30–40 loom adapter. Frankenstein is more of a modular design, where you add the extra modules as needed. Oddly enough, I've been looking at this thing for 2 months. I never noticed it didn't have a power supply on it. If you go to the manual hardware page, you select this hard U manual, and in there you pick Frankenstein, and you get to this page. And if you go to the bottom, it gives a recommendation for a common power supply to add. If you actually look on the forum, there's a 5-volt regulator post. This is where they're working on power supplies, if you're that way inclined. Next is the connector adapter, and if you go to the RusEFI master download in hardware, there's a number of connector boards here. But if yours is not there, you need to make a custom adapter. Another benefit of adapter boards is that you can add all the stuff you're missing to the adapter, so you'll effectively only have 2 parts instead of modules everywhere. In my case, I need a custom adapter to go from my stimulator to my Frankenstein, but using these connectors. My stimulator uses these connectors, and I have an adapter loom to my car with these connectors. Things I'm adding to my adapter board, besides the general connections, is a power supply, a map sensor, maybe a 2x16 display or even a 4x16, and a selector for different trigger sensors. If you come back to the hardware page, there is a sparse connection diagram, but surprisingly it tells you a lot. And the one thing I'm not keen about is the way the trigger inputs go into the board. Here Hall and Opticals is connected to these connectors, but VR are connected to these connectors. So effectively you've got 4 different wires going to 2 pins on the STM32. where for convenience I'd only want 2 wires coming in, handling Hall, optical and VR, going to the 2 pins on the STM. And that's what these jumpers down here do. The way it works is the Hall and optos come through these pins, through this op amp, and the output is through these 2 pins, which you hardwire to the trigger inputs of the STM on trigger pin 2 and trigger pin 1. But if you're using a VR, you come through these headers, and its output pins are here and here, which again you have to hardwire to the STM32's trigger input pin here, trigger 1 and trigger 2. The way I have it is one set of wires for trigger inputs. This crank goes to this header, and depending on whether you put the jumper on this side, it goes to the Hall in or the VR in. So the Hall in is one of these and the VR is one of these. Then it go through their respective circuits and out to another 2 set of wires. Those 2 wires go to here, to this jumper, and depending on which way you have the jumpers, it goes out this trigger wire, and those wires are directly connected to the pins of the STM. I think originally these jumpers here all worked and you could select between Hall and VR, which is a bit inconvenient because you have to pull the STM32 off each time you want to change it, because the STM had Hall input triggers here and VR triggers here. But now that there's only 2 pins as trigger inputs, you have to manually hardwire them. The normal person doesn't need selectable trigger inputs, so hardwiring is fine. But for experimentation, it's good to have a quick change system. The way you do one of these adapter boards is you'd lay out your factory connector here, then all the Frankenstein connections here, and then you basically match which ones link here to here. Like your coolant sensor goes to IP4. There's a lot of fart-arsing around chasing these labels and going to the schematics and associating everything back to your schematic. But that's what you have to do. If you need help with pinouts, just come here. And it gives an explanation to the pin number. If you come into PCB view with these settings, it'll give you the label and the pins, and just work through them. Just lay out your connectors, associate the net lists, and you come to your PCB view and move all your parts around where you want them, and everything should be connected with rat's nest lines, which look like this. And your board will be full of rat's nest lines, and you just truss these lines and make traces out of them. You can also highlight a net list to see if there's a closer connection point. I can see why no one makes their own PCBs anymore, because it's a lot of work compared to $2 for 100 square centimeters for someone else to make it. You have to buy a new laser printer when your old printer fucks up, then you have to print it on this special yellow paper and then iron it onto your PCB, etch the stupid thing, tin it, drill the holes, iron on the seal screen, and then check every single trace for shorts. Then we get to our usual part fitment, and again checking for shorts in case there's bridges. Then if we need greater current capacity, like our ground traces, we flux it and heat the solder on. We check our power supply and we put in 12 volts. And we're getting 5 volts out, so it must be okay. We have our Frankenstein. We have a 3D printed spacer with posts to straddle parts. And we have our adapter board. It's about 130 by 150 mil. You know how you come up with a plan and then when you put it together it doesn't work? Well, I originally went with a 44 pin connector because the other ECU I was working on only needed 44. But then I realized RusEFI has a lot more features and a lot more pins. And that's when I decided to add a connector with roughly the 80 pins required to future-proof this thing. I added some white jumper stops so you know where the 44 pin lines up. Well, it didn't turn out great, but I guess it'll do. There has been talk of making a new board with the connector already on it, and that would save this massive rat's nest, because all these wires would be traces on the board. If the connector was on the Frankenstein, it might be something like this.